this book. Notes. The endnotes that follow are only a fraction of the material that is available to the curious at encounterbooks.com/books/facing-reality. The notes I include here are restricted to material that readers might need to answer their most immediate questions. Some of that material cites specific sources, but most of the documentation of sources in this book is reserved for the online documentation. Facing Reality is not a formally academic text, so I have taken the liberty of streamlining my citation format to fit the way scholars actually do their research these days. They no longer acquire a specific volume of a technical journal from the library stacks and look up an article by using the issue number and page numbers in the citation. They type the title of the article. Even a portion of it is usually enough, and perhaps the surname of one of the authors into their internet browser and hit return. So I have used an abbreviated form of article citation, with everything needed to find the source. I include the page number for citations of direct quotes. In the case of internet sources, I avoid linking to a specific page because they so quickly go out of date, instead trying to give you a link that will get you to the correct website with enough additional information to let you search for the appropriate page. Chapter 1. The American Creed Imperiled. 1. Samuel P. Huntington's Who Are We? The Challenges to America's National Identity, a brilliant book, is the best recent source about the American Creed. The quotation is taken from p. 46. For descriptions of how thoroughly the American Creed, though not yet called that, permeated life in the early 19th century, see Francis Grund, The Americans and Their Moral, Social, and Political Relations, and, of course, Alexis de Tocqueville, Democracy in America. For a description of how the Creed persisted at the end of the 19th century, see a 2-volume study, James Bryce, The American Commonwealth. Bryce, a leading British scholar of American society at the time, reflected on certain dogmas or maxims, which are in so far fundamental that one usually strikes upon them when sinking a shaft, so to speak, in an American mind. Dogmas and maxims that amounted to the American Creed pp. 536-37. During World War I, the U.S. House of Representatives passed a resolution titled The American's Creed, written by William Tyler Page. It conveys elements of the creed as I describe it, but is by no means an official definition. To my knowledge, there isn't one. Chapter 2, Multiracial America. 1. In 2001, the Gallup polling organization found that the average American estimated that 32% of the population was black. The correct answer was 12.3%. The same poll found that the average American thought that 29% of the population was Latino. The correct answer was 12.5%. Joseph Carroll, Public Overestimates U.S. Black and Latino Populations, Gallup News. Gallup has not asked those questions since 2001, but a 2013 survey by the Center for American Progress indicated that the American public still overestimated the size of minority populations. Most blacks and Latinos thought that minorities combined already made up half the population or more, while non-Latino whites estimated that minorities were 48% of the population. Only Asians, who gave an estimate of 43%, were even close to the correct answer, which in 2013 was 37%. See Rui Teixeira and John Halpin, Building an All-In Nation, A View from the American Public Center for American Progress. 2. You may have a larger question about the substitution of European for white. Is it still accurate, given recent immigration of peoples from North Africa and the Middle East, who in the old terminology are classified as Caucasian? Part of the answer lies in the 23 ANME results showing that self-identified whites had 98.6% European ancestry. Additional evidence may be found in the combined ACS surveys for 2014 to 2018, which reveal that 95.1% of non-Latin whites who answered the Ancestry 1 question specified a European ancestry, while only 1.6% gave a North African or Middle Eastern ancestry. European seems reasonable as a way of identifying the way that the overwhelming majority of non-Latin whites think of themselves. 3. It is possible that the percentage of Latins in 1960 is understated. The limited information in the 1960 census is frustrating. There is no Latino category either as part of the "What race are you?" question or as a separate "What ethnicity are you?" question. A separate table shows country of birth for the foreign-born, reporting that 1,735,992 people were born in Mexico. But the numbers in the table for race are inconsistent with the numbers in the table on country of birth for the foreign-born. But my estimate could be too low by half, and we would still be talking about only 3 or 4% of the population who were not European or African. Chapter 3. Race Differences in Cognitive Ability. 1. If you want to know the whole story and are reasonably knowledgeable about statistics, go to Arthur Jensen's Magisterial The G Factor, The Science of Mental Ability. For more recent and readable discussions of what IQ tests measure, the thorough version is Russell Warren, In the Know, Debunking 35 Myths About Human Intelligence. A short, breezy, but scientifically accurate account is Stuart Ritchie, Intelligence, All That Matters. 2. The importance of self-esteem, so enthusiastically assumed by educators from the 1970s through the end of the century, flunked empirical attempts to demonstrate its causal role in academic performance or other achievements. A single comprehensive review article dismantled self-esteem's reputation among scholars, partly because of its massive documentation, and partly because the lead author had previously been an open advocate of the importance of self-esteem. See Roy Baumeister, Jennifer D. Campbell, Joachim I. Kruger, and Kathleen D. Vose. Does high self-esteem cause better performance, interpersonal success, happiness, or healthier lifestyles? Psychological Science in the Public Interest. Stereotype threat enjoyed a similar vogue from 1995 through the next 20 years. The concept was introduced by Claude M. Steele and Joshua Aronson in Stereotype Threat and the Intellectual Test Performance of African Americans, Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. It was seized upon so uncritically that by 2003, just 8 years after its debut, it was already covered in 2/3 of introductory psychology textbooks. Since 2015, its reputation has been battered by a series of failures to replicate the effects seen in early studies and by evidence of publication bias, the tendency of scholars to fail to publish negative results. Two of the most rigorous critiques leave little room for the advocates of stereotype threat to make their case. Paulette C. Floor and Jelty M. Wichertz. Does stereotype threat influence performance of girls in stereotype domains? A meta-analysis, Journal of School Psychology, and Oren Shuak, Paul R. Sackett, and Sander Quint. Stereotype threat effects in settings, with features likely versus unlikely in operational test settings. A meta-analysis, Journal of Applied Psychology. The former co-authored by one of the world's most highly regarded quantitative social science methodologists. Jelty Wichertz concluded that based on the small average effect size in our meta-analysis, which is most likely inflated due to publication bias, we would not feel confident to proclaim that stereotype manipulations will harm mathematic performance of girls in a systematic way. P41. The latter article, written by a team of psychologists at the University of Minnesota, concluded, based on the result of the focal analysis, operational and motivational subsets, and publication bias analyses, we conclude that the burden of proof shifts back to those that claim that stereotype threat exerts a substantial effect on standardized test takers. 3. If you have come to facing reality thinking that Stephen Jay Gould demolished the concept of G 40 years ago with the mismeasure of man, you should know that the scientific consensus about that book is that Gould had attacked psychometrics as it stood in the 1930s and systematically misrepresented psychometrics as it stood when he was writing in the 1970s. See Arthur Jensen, The Debunking of Scientific Fossils and Straw Persons, Contemporary Education Review, Bernard D. Davis, Neo-Lysenkoism, IQ and the Press, Public Interest, and John B. Carroll, Reflections on Stephen Jay Gould's The Mismeasure of Man, a retrospective review, Intelligence. A 2019 analysis by a team of psychologists concluded as follows: given Gould's pervasively incorrect statements in The Mismeasure of Man about the Army Beta, factor analysis, the place of intelligence testing in the immigration debates of the 1920s, the biological basis for intelligence, and the questions regarding Gould's analysis of Morton's work, We wonder whether there is any section of the mismeasure of man that is factually accurate. Russell T. Warren, Jared Z. Burton, Isa Gibbons, and Daniel A. Melendez, Stephen J. Gould's analysis of the Army beta test in The Mismeasure of Man, Distortions and Misconceptions Regarding a Pioneering Mental Test, Journal of Intelligence, p. 18. Emphasis in the original. Or you may think that Nassim Taleb has more recently proved that, as he titled his article, IQ is largely a pseudoscientific swindle. Medium.com/inserto. Several responses are available on the internet. One of the first but also most direct is Sean Last, Nassim Taleb on IQ, archive.ph/pcbgk. Jonathan Pallison gives a highly technical response in Taleb is wrong about IQ, jsmp.dk, but that's unavoidable in dealing with some of Taleb's statistical assertions. James Thompson has an accessible series of articles about Taleb's arguments. The first three are Swanning About, Fooled by Algebra, In the Wake of the Swan, and The Intelligent Investor, all available at the UNZ Review unz.com. 4. Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences is orthogonal to the psychometrics literature. His presentation of the theory in Frames of Mind, The Theory of Multiple Intelligences, is a fascinating discussion of human talents. But he has never tried to prove statistically that his intelligences can be distinguished from G or from personality traits. Gardner offered this amusing and I think correct observation in a 2018 interview. I have never been able to reconstruct when I made the fateful decision not to call these abilities talents or gifts, but rather to call them intelligences. Because if I had called them anything else, I would not be well known in different corners of the world and journalists like you wouldn't come to interview me. It was picking the word intelligence and pluralizing it. Liz Mineo, the greatest gift you can have is a good education, one that isn't strictly professional, Harvard Gazette. 5. The results from all the known studies of African intelligence through the 1950s are reported in Audrey M. Shuey, The Testing of Negro Intelligence. The first large sample used to calculate African cognitive ability was assembled during World War I, when the U.S. Army used 2 IQ tests for incoming recruits, one designed for literate recruits and the other designed for illiterate or non-English-speaking recruits. Robert Yerkes found a European-African difference of 1.16 SDS, reported in John C. Lowland, Gardner Lindsay, and J. N. Spuler. Race differences in intelligence, but little confidence can be attached to that number. Even a bad elementary education is associated with a substantial increase in cognitive ability over a population with no elementary education. As of World War I, 70% of all blacks still lived in the rural South, where most African children got only the most rudimentary education or no education at all. There is reason to believe that this population was underrepresented among those draftees who reached the point of being administered the Army Alpha and Army Beta tests. See Jeanette Keith, Rich Man's War, Poor Man's Fight, Race, Class, and Power in the Rural South during the First World War. The caution with which one must approach the World War I data is accentuated by the data from World War II. The European-African difference on the Army General Classification Test for inductions in 1944 to 1945 has been put at 1.52 SDS Lowland, race differences. This represents the scores of men born from 1925 to 1927 and is very close to the 1.59 SD difference observed among the Woodcock-Johnson subjects born in the 1920s. See Charles Murray, The Magnitude and Components of Change in the Black-White IQ Difference from 1920 to 1991. A birth cohort analysis of the Woodcock-Johnson standardizations, intelligence. How could the European-African difference in cognitive ability have risen from 1.16 SDS to 1.52 SDs in 20 years? The simplest explanation is that the World War II testing produced a more accurate estimate of the European-African difference than did the World War I testing. 6. The phrase G-loaded traces its roots to the English psychologist Charles Spearman's seminal 1904 article, General Intelligence, Objectively Determined and Measured in the American Journal of Psychology. Spearman observed that students' test scores across unrelated subjects were statistically correlated. His explanation was that the correlations reflected a general underlying mental ability, which he called G for general. The most powerful tool for measuring G is a statistical method called factor analysis. When the subtests in an IQ test battery are factor analyzed, the first factor always explains a much larger proportion of the variation across the subtests than any other. That first factor is G. The G loading of a subtest is its correlation with the overall measure of G. I sometimes use the phrase more loosely to signify a test that is a good measure of G, meaning that its correlation with the overall measure of G would be high if it were a subtest in an IQ test battery. 7. Scores on academic achievement tests are affected by the test taker's education. You can't score well on a reading comprehension test unless you know how to read. But reading tests such as the ones for the NAEP or the SAT don't ask how much the student has learned with questions, for example, about how Middlemarch fits into the history of the English novel. The tests present passages of text and ask about the meaning of those self-contained passages, which calls directly upon the test taker's ability to figure things out. The same principle applies to the NAEP math tests. The items are devised so that they presume only the math courses that are normally required of 4th, 8th, and 12th graders. The test items require the students to figure out the answers from information contained in the items themselves. Composites of the major standardized tests of math and reading skills are thus G-loaded, but they don't provide as good a measure of G as a more comprehensive set of cognitive subtests. 8. The group differences are likely to increase as highly G-loaded tests are added because of another of Charles Spearman's hypotheses. The higher the G-loading of a subtest, the greater the size of group differences in IQ. The hypothesis has subsequently been confirmed through an extensive literature. See Arthur Jensen, The G Factor, The Science of Mental Ability, pp. 369-402. 9. The proper method for combining separate measures depends on what you're trying to measure. Sometimes it is appropriate to add them. For example, if you are trying to measure a family's aggregate income, you just add wages and dividend income. Sometimes to take the mean, for example, of judges' ratings in a gymnastics competition. And sometimes, as in the case of measuring cognitive ability, to add them after taking into account what they share. Verbal and mathematics ability are expressions of the same mental ability to some extent, but also contribute independently to mental ability. The size of the add-on to a simple mean depends on the correlation between the two test scores. If the correlation were a perfect one, the correct composite score would be the mean of the two scores because the two tests are imparting exactly the same information about mental ability. The lower the correlation between the tests, the more that each test is contributing independently to the measure of cognitive ability. As an empirical matter, correlations of reading and math tests in different studies cluster in the 2 range, which means a modest but non-trivial add-on to the mean. Think of the standard deviation SD as a measure of spread-outness in a distribution of scores. If you're measuring height and your sample consists of 5-year-olds, the SD of height is going to be compressed into a range of a few inches. If your sample includes everyone from infants to adults, the spread of heights will include everyone from newborns to NBA players, and the SD will be much larger. The equation for computing a standard deviation of a population is this, where S the standard deviation of a sample sigma means sum of x equal to each value in the dataset, x mean of all values in the dataset, n equal to number of values in the dataset. Just as the average of a set of numbers is its sum divided by the number of numbers, the standard deviation represents the average difference between the numbers in a set and the mean for that set. That's not precisely correct. Note the need to square the differences and eventually take the square root, but it's a convenient way to remember the basic concept. Any set of scores can be converted to z-scores, but a normal distribution is necessary for accurate conversion of z-key scores to percentiles. 12. Recent years have seen much work on establishing IQ estimates for countries around the world, but that is no help in trying to estimate ethnic subgroup means for U.S. populations. The United States does not draw a nationally representative sample of immigrants from anywhere. If you want to get a sense of how much work has been done and some of the controversies surrounding estimates of national IQ, visit the National IQ Dataset, a site that maintains a curated inventory of the studies of national IQ and posts discussions of many of the technical issues. As of February 2020, I found the releases of the dataset at v1aq.org/page_ID9 and the discussions at v1aq.org/.13. I've been writing about interventions to raise IQ for a long time. For a review of the state of knowledge, as of the early 1990s, see Chapter 17 of Richard Herrnstein and Charles Murray, The Bell Curve, Intelligence and Class Structure in American Life, 1994. For an update through the first half of the 2000s, see Chapter 2 of Charles Murray, Real Education, 4 Simple Rules for Bringing American Education Back to Reality, 2008. For a discussion that incorporates recent developments in the understanding of heritability in the non-shared environment as they relate to early interventions, see Chapter 13 of Charles Murray, Human Diversity, The Biology of Gender, Race, and Class, 2020. I will not try to summarize the many findings here, but one is so uncontested that it deserves mention. For the vast majority of U.S. children, low scores on cognitive tests are not changed by remedial courses. Much more intensive efforts are required, and even those have produced disappointing results. A few experimental pre-K programs have produced statistically significant gains on exit tests, but these results suffer from fade-out. A good optimistic review of the pre-K literature is Greg J. Duncan and Catherine Magnuson, Investing in Preschool Programs, Journal of Economic Perspectives. A good skeptical review of the evidence is Grover J. Whitehurst, Does State Pre-K Improve Children's Achievement? Brookings, 14. Each item in a major test is scrutinized for evidence that it is unusually hard for some group, that is not just harder for that group than for another group, but harder in relation to other items in the same test. For example, suppose that the group difference runs between 0.6 and 0.8 SDs for 19 out of 20 items on an IQ subtest, but is 1.5 SDs on the remaining one. That would be a red flag that something other than a difference in G is affecting the result on that item. Once a draft of the test passes scrutiny on the individual items, it can be tested for measurement and variance. The technique of choice is multiple group confirmatory factor analysis. Cognitive tests have complex structures. There are a variety of ways to determine whether the structures are the same for different groups by measuring not only whether the factor structures themselves are similar, but also whether the factor loadings, intercepts, and residual variances are similar across groups. Together, these constitute strong evidence that the test is measuring the same construct for different groups. All the current versions of the major tests are known to be factor invariant. Chapter 4. Race Differences in Violent Crime. 1. The exact bases for a legal arrest vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but 3 are common to all. The police officer personally observed a crime taking place. The police officer at the scene has probable cause to believe that the arrestee recently committed or is about to commit a crime. The police officer has an arrest warrant issued by a judge. Probable cause means that the police officer has specific, tangible evidence within the officer's knowledge that would lead a reasonable person to think the arrestee is guilty. From a social scientist's perspective, an arrest by the police has several advantages as evidence of race differences in crime. Most police do not make arrests lightly, for reasons both professional and practical. With misdemeanors, a warning can often solve a problem without getting the culprit enmeshed in the criminal justice system. With felonies, police are aware how easily a prosecution can get thrown out if there's a problem with probable cause. Even a completely legal arrest involves a lot of paperwork. From the social scientist perspective, these disincentives to arrest people give the arrest extra credibility as evidence that a meaningful offense occurred and that the police arrested a plausible suspect. Another reason that arrests for violent offenses are especially valuable for assessing race differences in criminal behavior is that they are largely insulated from the usual problems that raise public concern. Much of the criticism of the police involves situations that give police officers considerable latitude in deciding whether to intervene. Examples are stop and frisk, arrests for minor offenses as part of broken windows policing, enforcement of vice laws, and enforcement of drug laws. Given credible evidence that a murder, rape, robbery, or aggravated assault has been committed, there is much less police discretion about whether to act. It's not just the seriousness of the crimes that sets arrest for violent crimes apart, it's also the circumstances under which those crimes get into the statistics. Police seldom catch offenders in the act of murdering, raping, robbing, or assaulting. Far more commonly, the crimes occur and then come to the attention of the police. The potential for the police to manufacture violent offenses for Africans or Latins while overlooking them for Europeans is constrained. 2. The proper calculation of the arrest rate for any group is to divide the number of arrests by the total number of people in that group in the jurisdiction where the arrests occurred. The ratio of two rates is one divided by another. If the Latin arrest rate for some crime is 50 per 100,000 and the Asian arrest rate for that crime is 20 per 100,000, the Latin-Asian ratio of rates is 50% divided by 20%, or 2.5 to 1. Just about every arrest rate by race you have ever seen in print or on television has been presented in terms of the percentage of arrests of a given race relative to that race's percentage of the national population. If Latins are 18% of the population, but they account for 27% of the arrests for violent crime, it looks as if the disproportion amounts to 27 divided by 18, or 1.50, meaning that Latins were arrested 50% more often than their proportion of the population would predict. The problem is that Latins, and Africans and Asians as well, are not spread evenly around the country. To see why this is important, imagine a nation with a majority population of 1 million and a minority population of 50,000. A member of the majority was arrested 5,000 times last year. A member of the minority was arrested 2,000 times. The total number of arrests in this nation last year was 7,000. So a newspaper story reads, "Minority accounts for 29% of the arrests despite being less than 5% of the population. That's a ratio of 6 to 1. That is the usual arithmetic behind reports of race differences in arrest rates. It's not arithmetically wrong, but how meaningful is it? If every jurisdiction in the country has precisely the national percentages of majority and minority, it's meaningful. But as it happens, my fictional nation consists entirely of rural countryside, with the exception of a single city inhabited by 50,000 of the majority and all 50,000 of the minority. So the city experienced 250 arrests of members of the majority last year, its fair share of the 5,000 arrests of the majority, and all 2,000 of the arrests of the minority. That means the minority accounted for 89% of the arrests in the city, or a ratio of 2,000 to 250, which equals 8 to 1. For everyone outside the city, the 6 to 1 national ratio is meaningless in terms of their own lives. If an arrest occurs where they live, the probability that it was committed by a member of the minority is not 89%, it is 0. The city is the only place in the country where race differences in arrest rates are relevant, and the relevant ratio is 8 to 1. Such problems are common when statistics are aggregated. Suppose you wanted to investigate gender discrimination in a university's faculty and based your conclusions on all the departments combined. The patterns you observe in the university as a whole could be radically different from those in either the physics department or the sociology department. The kinds of mistakes I'm describing are sometimes grouped under the label ecological fallacy. 3. For a list of cities and counties with open data sites, see data.gov or. I found the 13 cities by checking each of the 200 largest American cities for an open data file of arrest records, and conducted additional searches that identified a few smaller jurisdictions with downloadable arrest records. A 14th city, Dallas, has released its arrest records, but they have been purged of all arrests for murder and rape, making the Dallas statistics incomparable with those of the other 13. Getting from the raw data in the downloadable databases to arrest rates required all the usual steps involved in cleaning databases, plus a crucial additional one: identifying the arrests that qualify as arrests for index crimes under the UCR criteria. The Chicago database of arrests had a variable that explicitly classified arrests as index crimes under the FBI definition. For the other 12 cities, I used variables that classified arrests according to the legal definitions used in their jurisdiction. For most crimes, this was not a problem. Arrests for homicides in all 13 cities discriminated between murder and various degrees of manslaughter. Arrests for serious assaults were usually described with the word aggravated, or by other details that qualified the assault as aggravated, for example ADW, meaning assault with a deadly weapon. For databases that classified a crime by first degree, second degree, or third degree, I looked up the legal definition for that jurisdiction to determine which categories would qualify under the FBI definition. The crime that proved hardest to classify confidently was theft. The official FBI definition does not specify a dollar value, implying that even the most minor thefts could qualify. The arrest databases almost always had subcategories of theft defined by the dollar value. I designated a given arrest as an index theft using a combination of minimum value, usually $500, and police classification of the theft as a felony. I am sure that my decision rules did not perfectly identify the set of arrests that each police department submitted to the UCR, but I am confident that the overlap is extremely high. Moreover, there is no reason to think that the misclassified arrests would tend to overestimate or underestimate arrests by race. 4. Fayetteville broke out Latins as a separate category, but the Fayetteville database also included the name of each arrestee. Upon examination, it was apparent that many people with Latin names had not been classified as Latin. I'm not referring to borderline names that might possibly be Latin, but rather to names such as Gonzalez or Gomez. I attempted to prepare corrected numbers of Latin arrests, but going solely by names is too inaccurate, so I decided not to report a Latin rate for Fayetteville. I have no idea what the correct number might be. 5. Stuart DeLessio and Lisa Stolzenberg, Race and the Probability of Arrest, Social Forces 2003, p. 1381. A little history will help set the context of the quotation. One of the first systematic analyses of crime, based on delinquency among the entire birth cohort of males born in Philadelphia, in 1945, found that the rate of contacts of juveniles with the police was 139.9 per 1,000 for non-whites and 9.2 per 1,000 for whites, a ratio of 15.2. C. Marvin E. Wolfgang, Robert M. Figlio, and Thorsten Sellen, Delinquency in a Birth Cohort, 1972. That was an unpopular finding in the 1970s, when the conventional wisdom among sociologists was that race differences in crime were an artifact. Their position was supported by self-report studies of criminal behavior that found only minor race differences. C. J.R. Williams and Martin Gold, From Delinquent Behavior to Official Delinquency, Social Forces 1972, and Martin Gold and David Reimer, Changing Patterns of Delinquent Behavior Among Americans 13 through 16 Years Old, Crime and Delinquency Literature, 1975. Then in 1978, the criminologist Michael Hindelang published a landmark study in which he compared arrest data to victimization surveys. His conclusion: these data for rape, robbery, and assault are generally consistent with official data on arrestees and support the differential involvement hypothesis. Some evidence of differential selection for criminal justice processing is found, however. Most of the racial disproportionality in arrest data is shown by victimization survey data to be attributable to the substantially greater involvement of blacks in the common law personal crimes of rape, robbery, and assault. These results suggest that traditional admonitions against using arrest data as an index of involvement in these crimes may be overly cautious. Hindelang, Race and Involvement in Common Law Personal Crimes, American Sociological Review, p. 93. Hindelang's findings guided criminologists for the next 30 years, with some 160 studies citing him to justify the use of arrest data as a surrogate measure of criminal offending. The DeLessio and Stolzenberg study in 2003 took advantage of a new database, the National Incident-Based Reporting System, to reinvestigate the issue with a more rigorous research design than was possible with the data that Hindelang had had to work with. The authors used multivariate logistic regression to calculate the probability of arrest after taking several independent variables into account. The independent variables included, among others, the race, sex, and age of both the victim and the offender, whether the victim was injured, whether a deadly weapon was used, the relationship between the victim and the offender, and the location of the crime. The objective of the analysis was to test whether, given that the race of the offender was identified, black citizens have a higher probability of being subjected to arrest than white citizens. The quotation in the text continued with this conclusion. These findings suggest that the disproportionately high arrest rate for black citizens is most likely attributable to differential involvement in reported crime, rather than to racially biased law enforcement practices. That's where the science on this issue still stands as I write. 6. According to Africans who reported crimes, the African-European ratio of alleged perpetrators was 82.9%, and the Latin European ratio was 8.3%. According to Latins who reported crimes, the African-European ratio of alleged perpetrators was 14.9%, and the Latin European ratio was 26.3%. 7. The emphasis that police departments put on identifying hotspots, plus the ease with which police can use a mapping app to get GPS coordinates, has led many departments to include GPS coordinates for the arrest as part of the arrest record. These in turn can be reverse geocoded to yield the zip code in which the arrest fell. I should add that care must be taken in curating these data. Apparently, arresting officers often record the GPS coordinates of the police station where the suspect was booked rather than the location of the crime, and local jails generate a disproportionate number of charges of inmates that are recorded as arrests. The reverse geocoding for my databases was done by Texas A&M Geo Services. Chapter 5. First-order effects of race differences in cognitive ability. 1. In the 2020 SAT Suite of Assessments Annual Report, downloadable at collegeboard.org.